SUERF, the European Money and Finance Forum, bringing together policymakers, finance, and academia.
Welcome to this SUERF ECB Banca Finland Banca d'Italia workshop on ECB macroeconomic models for forecasting and policy analysis, state of play, appraisal, and way forward. This workshop was inspired by the publication of ECB Occasional Paper number 344, where the ECB provides a wealth of information on their model toolbox, state of play and way forward. I can really recommend to everybody having a closer look at this important document. Let me thank Matthieu Darracq Pariès, Juha Kilponen and Alessandro Notarpietro from the ECB, from the Bank of Finland, and from the Banca d'Italia for the great cooperation in putting together this workshop. Without further ado, let me hand over to Juha Kilponen, Head of the Monetary Policy and Research Department of the Bank of Finland, who will moderate the first part of the workshop. Over to you, Juha.
Thank you, Ernest, and good afternoon indeed from Finland. As we already heard in this session, we will hear on the macroeconomic models that are used in forecasting and policy analysis at the European Central Bank. And as you can see from the program, the presentation is based on this recent occasional paper that Ernest already mentioned, and you can indeed find it from the ECB website. All the editors of the paper, Matteo Ciccarelli, Matthieu Darracq Pariès, and Romanos Prifitis, all who are deeply involved in macroeconomic modeling, will be presenting. So you will have 30 minutes in total, which leaves us 15 minutes for questions and answers from the webinar participants. And so, without further ado, floor is yours. I guess Matthieu will start. So Matthieu, go ahead.
I actually start myself.
Okay, Matteo.
No worries, it's fine. This is an out program. I was supposed to do something else, but thank you very much. This is a great occasion actually for us to showcase a lot of things that we have been doing over the years. The idea started a little bit before the last strategy review, but it was somewhat parked because the strategy review itself provided a Eurosystem modeling report. Some of you may remember that, and you actually, Matteo, were in the lead for that report, and Notarpietro, who is also in the call. Now, it's just a way of taking stock of our work, show the capabilities of our model. Of course, some models of the ECB, because this is a forecasting and policy modeling division. I think it's important to mention and to acknowledge the work done in other areas, like DG monetary policy, for instance. Actually, we have in place a strict protocol with monetary policy by which they are responsible for, mostly for the monetary models that can provide paths, some paths, and for some of the variables that then are run through our machinery, and there is a joint collective work. But today we will focus only on the selection model of the FPM. So the chapter has been written between two strategy reviews. There's going to be a next one. Perhaps is this a moment of say it's the end of a cycle or the beginning of a reflection by taking stock of what has happened and thinking about what is the future of models. And that is so just to give you, before giving the floor to Matthieu for the policy part, I think it's a reflection mostly of how serious the ECB has always taken this suite of model approach that we are using, and you will see some very good applications of it. Without that, so maybe the next slide is going to give you an overview. So that's where we start, the suite of model approach, and then some policy cases with projection, scenario, risk, and monetary policy, some forecasting and policy analysis under high uncertainty, and why it's important to investing in model infrastructure and the current agenda to conclude. Matthieu, you can continue from there. Thank you.
Thanks, Matteo. So let me bring you first to, let's say, the presentation of where we stand in the set of main macro models or typology of macro models we have developed and maintained and used in monetary policy preparation. So before that, one stylized big picture statements. So certainly today's approach of ECB staff towards macro modeling is to entertain and maintain a suite of models. And this comes more or less from and you will find, for those who are courageous to read this occasional paper, and has also a historical narrative on how the models at the ECB have evolved through time. So certainly there was never an aspiration to get one desk for one type of model fixing everything. Also, there's always a continuity in the assessment and the idea of changing the models as we go along, and avoid too much of a Darwinian strategy as one next generation of model replacing fully the other in a non-gradual way. But at the same time, I think the ECB staff modeling approach still keep a very acute eye on the state of the art of whatever academic standards or the level of technical progress on many aspects of modeling efforts are, and where we position ourselves. But there are key differences when you serve that for an institution, and I will expand a bit on this. So we have a suite of model approach. What are exactly the guiding principles for this suite of model? So we have stated 4. The first one is certainly robustness. Robustness in the range of how much theoretical sanity or theoretical paradigm should be reflected in the workhorse models, and also perhaps the empirical performance of it. So let's assume you can stretch a trade-off in between conceptual or theoretical and empirical. If this is such a thing, we have tried to become robust in this dimension. The second guiding principle is like the complexity of the monetary union is to be able to actually approach the euro area outlook or monetary policy evaluations or any type of other policy issues, both from an aggregate and multi-country perspective. And when you bring these 2 dimensions into a modeling strategy, that creates also a clear guideline for what to go for. The third guiding principle is the notion of interaction between few main models. Let's call that, this is our terminology, but let's call them main macroeconometric models that are supposed to be deployed across a wide range of policy functions. That would be, to me, one qualification. And those, let's say, a bit more multi-purpose models, of course, have to live in sync and in symbiosis with other more tailored either tools, satellite, or actually more advanced or more academic type of models. And I think this interaction between main and satellite models, the way we name them now, is quite key in our model portfolio. And the fourth guiding principle is evolutionary. So meaning we are gradualist, but we go somewhere, and we are influenced indeed by nature, what happens in the economy, by the organization itself, how the institution may be changing, or how the frontier in academia may give us new ideas or new benchmarks, actually. And those are a bit the guiding principles. That leads me to where we are today. So today we are bucketing more or less in these 3 columns and 2 colors, the macro modeling portfolio. You see that this robustness I mentioned, we clustered the type of model we have in between those that are very theoretical, quite theoretical, we call them structural, semi-structural models, that gets a bit this trade-off, and we'll come back to it in terms of structural design and empirical flexibility, and more empirical or let's say, empirical strategies of towards macroeconomics. And there you see 2 types of colors, now what we call main models and satellite models. So in the main macroeconometric models of the ECB, on the structural side, you have the new WM project that has been there for more than a decade now, and in different installments, different advances. But this is really one main model surrounded by a universe, I would say, of DSG type of model developed and still in use, or other approaches which are more structural in nature, like ENC modeling, for example. In the middle column, the current core semi-structural models at the ECB is the ECB Base project or ECB MC project, which has indeed the blueprints called ECB Base, which is for the euro area, and its companion, which is the multi-country setting of it for the largest countries of the euro area. And on the right-hand side, the empirical set, you have a wide range of econometrics, structural econometrics, and other variety of, I would say, quantitative macroeconomic frameworks, which are surrounding and interacting with these main models for different activities. Let me dwell 1 minute on perhaps the business case of the semi-structural models, and I think I reinforce the idea that we had to develop and these long-lasting efforts of maintaining and having new generation of semi-structural models come along again with 4 motivations. I will go briefly, but certainly once you have to encompass the needs of multi-country modeling for a variety of policy activities, the semi-structural approach gives a tractability element that it's hard to beat. The second is the conceptual flexibility. It has been the case for many of our needs that changing the structural, let's say the conceptual design of some of the features of the models, be it on the expectation formation or on the role of specific sectors or the financial transmission, has been an adaptability on the modeling design, which has been very much instrumental to its success in the policy context. The third rationale is definitely the empirical flexibility to get more granular, to connect more to short-term forecasting tools or more granularity in data. And finally, the institutional flexibility, the ability to connect to wider groups within the institutions or to reach out to different type of policy activities within the institution. So I will close this first chapter just by showing that having a suite of model approach has plenty of very appealing properties. One property you have to live with is the model heterogeneity. Also in results, I'm not here to dwell on the picture itself, but in a simple monetary policy shock. Here you have 2 ECB models, base model and the new WM against, let's say, models from other institutions. You will have to live with the idea that not all models would agree. Already, a given model may not agree for a given question. There are different ways of interpreting it. Once you put several models onto it, you have to indeed live with the complexity of having several models. And that brings me naturally to how we use them. So we have a suite of models and different type of policy users. So how do we go about it? Here I would flag mainly 3 buckets of policy activities for monetary policy preparation, let's say. One bucket is about economic projections, which go along with how you deploy these large macroeconometric models for economic narratives and forecasting with judgment, which is ultimately the way it's done at the ECB and in the Euro system. The second policy activity is more in the realm of a broad risk analysis, which takes the form of sensitivity, what-if type of scenarios, to risk metrics or fully fledged alternative macro contingencies. And we'll give also more realistic example of that in the next section. And the third use case for all of us is policy analysis, certainly in the realm of monetary policy, but also beyond. And the fair share of our time is devoted to also the fiscal monetary mix or even evaluating financial policies in a macroeconomic context. And I will briefly give you not so much economic signals from such use cases, but the typology of what we do. So natural use case of the model, of the suite of models, is to use in general more naturally the DSG models, the structural models, to bring economic narratives. You see in this slide the decomposition of economic activity, so real GDP and inflation in the euro area, but in sample and also for vintage of a projection. So without dwelling on what you really see there, the main idea is like the business case of deploying DSG to strengthen what are the economic drivers of what has happened and how it will shape the outlook is a key element on how we deploy the models in real time. Beyond the economic narrative, you have to make up the forecast, make up the number themselves. And for that, I think we have in our own internal analytical process the ambition of letting the model play to the extent that they can. So you see in this flow chart in the first row, it's how would you come up with the notion of letting the model run? And when we craft now the economic projections, letting the model run is actually akin to a notion of conditional forecast, where the conditioning takes a variety of forms. Certainly, we have a lot of conventions of assumptions that kickstart an economic projections, from the international environment to some notion of for the ECB stuff, asset pricing assumptions. We also take on board what is the state of the economy, and this goes beyond having the latest release of economic data. Actually, it comes with what is the state of the economy and what would higher frequency information tell us about the current and next quarters. So those become conditioning information for the large macroeconometric models. And we also have a set of more long run or let's say medium to long term anchors or assumptions. So evaluation on the supply side, fundamentals of the labor market, status of expectations. A lot of these conditioning environments are put into practice when we let the model run. And so that gets a bit some type of benchmark model-based references. And this is, I speak now in the generic language. And when we let that operate, it structures a bit how the experts, our country desk, or those that crafted the final numbers of the projections can also apply their own judgment. Each of these stages, what are the relevant role of assumptions? What do we see in the short-term outlook that should depart or not from the given models, or other type of judgment? This is how we could help structuring the final numbers. So I think I don't need to dwell too much on that, but I show you here for one vintage distant enough from today's conditions, a bit what would happen when you look at the baseline and what could be a benchmark from a area-wide model, which is the base now, against the final baseline. No? And we operate them on different modalities. Some we call projection update, other conditional forecast. If you want to know what it is, I would guide you to the occasional paper. But it gives the idea that we let the model run, and it can actually bring some yardstick on how the relevant judgmental interventions have been operated. And naturally, we put here in this illustration more the ECB-based, the semi-structural models, because for the backbones of how the numbers are generated, the structural models play really the chunk of the role. The second bucket of activities was the risk analysis. So I can go fast on that because the relevant application will be presented by Romanos also later on. But just to say that all the modeling portfolio is here to give a baseline number or sensitivity analysis, like a small scenarios, but they can also operate on risk metrics. So you see in this table for the ECB-based WM or other type of BVARs, projection densities. So under different type of conditions, when you let the model run, when you're around the baseline, or when you consider parametric scenarios, like what if the behavior of price and wage settings or expectation formation do not conform what we have assumed in the baseline. So no need. You will find some of this picture in the occasional paper, but that's a typical use case we can have also in the distributional metrics. No? So if your attention is more geared to specific events in the joint distribution of macro outcomes, this is how we evaluate it on the baseline and on the alternative conditions. And I can close now on monetary policy analysis. And like Matteo said at the beginning, when it comes to impact studies in monetary policy, for example, this is one evaluation done perhaps 1 year ago on the role of the tightening cycle, and this is a good opportunity to introduce also how we use models that were not presented directly as what we call core main models. Here you see the MMR, which is developed and largely used by our monetary policy department colleagues. So this is exactly a typical case. When we have specialized and devoted analysis, we feed the analysis and we give, and the specialized tools are giving also precedence on it. I would stop there for the generic illustration of what are the use cases of the portfolio and give the floor to Romanos for bringing you a bit more economic light into that. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you very much, Matthieu. So in the next section, the next few slides, I will discuss how the models that Matthieu presented previously can in principle be used for forecasting and policy analysis during periods of high uncertainty. So when there are large and unexpected shocks, the principle is that the use of statistical risk metrics becomes technically challenging because the unique nature of such large shocks makes it difficult to use standard econometric analysis to characterize uncertainty, meaning that impulse response functions or conditional forecasts with extreme values tend to become explosive. So as a result, in this environment of Knightian uncertainty, if you want, or a multimodal risk profile, scenario analysis effectively paves the way for risk analysis. So the sequence of shocks that hit the Euro economy since 2020 onwards have presented several opportunities for such a scenario analysis to be taken place. And here at the bottom, we present some examples. The idea is that these scenarios are topical in nature and focus on unprecedented events where no or little information can be utilized from the past. So, for example, pandemic scenarios were introduced in 2020, or a range of cases for assessing the impact of the Russia-Ukraine war, but also the escalation of the conflict in the Middle East. Now, the flowchart on the next slide illustrates the process through which this dedicated scenario analysis takes place. This is applied to the case of the pandemic, but a similar principle applies to all counterfactual scenarios that we may conduct. The idea is that a dedicated interdisciplinary team of experts from several business areas sits down together and using auxiliary models, satellite models, derive counterfactual paths for the evolution of different variables of our models, like the short-term GDP growth or financial spreads or global trade linkages, assumptions which can be used as conditioning factors into our models to perform conditional projections and derive the full macroeconomic outcome. So the model that typically is used is the semi-structural model, the ECB base, although in principle any model can be used for this exercise. The ECB base is preferred because of its greater flexibility, like Matthieu already discussed, and its ability to handle different types of data and granularity. In the next slide, this slide illustrates as an example the different scenarios which were developed to understand the consequences of the pandemic in September 2020 projection round. The blue line refers to the baseline at the time, and the yellow and red lines are the two scenarios. So the mild scenario in yellow is one which manifests as a more negative demand shock, if you want, with upward risks on inflation, while the severe scenario, the one in red, is the one that manifests as a more, the yellow is the positive demand shock, the red is the negative demand shock, which manifests as downside risks on GDP and inflation. Interestingly, besides just developing scenarios, at the time of the COVID pandemic, a companion model was also built, the ECB Basir. This is an extension of the ECB base model with an epidemiological block. And that model was used to cross-check the forecast and the scenarios at the time by producing this density forecast, which you can see in the gray shaded area on this chart, which refers to which provides confidence intervals reflecting the uncertainty around pandemic developments and vaccinations and so on and so forth. Now, in the next slide, another example of a recent scenario which was undertaken was one to determine the effects of a potential escalation of the conflict in the Middle East. Here, the scenario team focused on alternative assumptions for energy prices, as you can see on the left, which motivate different paths for this synthetic energy price index, but also different assumptions on possible financial repercussions that may arise of this escalation, motivated here or translated here through a movement in this US stock market volatility index. And on the right, assumptions about changes in global trade to motivate changes in for euro area foreign demand growth. In the next slide, these assumptions are then used as conditioning factors into the model to come up with this notion of the projection update. So the black line represents the baseline, and the red is the scenario we have just discussed. As you can see, it presents downside risks on GDP growth in the short run and upside risks on inflation also in the short run. Interestingly, beyond just the ability of these models to generate these conditional projections, the model also has the ability to decompose the factors or the shocks which contribute to the evolution of the scenario. And as you can see, they have a relatively close mapping between the assumption that the team devises and the shock itself. So increases in uncertainty or increase in energy prices or a decline in euro area demand growth are what tend to cause the decline, to lead to the downside risk on real GDP in the short run. And high energy prices are mostly contributing for the increase in HSCP inflation in the short run. In the next slide, so the idea is that while such scenarios are important to evaluate policy or possible shocks ex ante, it's important to highlight that they can also be used to inform the real-time forecast in subsequent periods when these possible shocks may in fact materialize in practice. So this slide illustrates the sequence of scenario analyses conducted for evaluating the consequence of the energy price increases following from this conflict between Russia and Ukraine that started in March 2022. So the blue lines on this slide illustrate the baseline forecast from each round in 2022, from each forecasting round in March, September, and December, while each orange line refers to the scenario undertaken around the baseline in each of these rounds. If we focus on the right-hand side chart and the evolution of HSCP inflation, becomes evident that the scenario in the previous round, so the solid orange line, approximates well the baseline forecast of the subsequent round, the dashed blue line, so from March to September, which our models are then called to cross-check by performing a projection updates and conditional forecasts. In the next slide, so besides, however, conducting scenarios in periods of high uncertainty, it also becomes important to be flexible to onboard additional tools and models that may have comparative advantages in speaking to the topical themes of each projection round. So, for example, to analyze more carefully the post-pandemic inflation surge, what the division did was to onboard the model recently developed by Bernanke and Blanchard and estimated and applied to the euro area setting. So this Blanchard-Bernanke model is a semi-structural model of aggregate wage price determination consisting of 4 equations appended with a structural vector autoregression. And besides using it for conditional projections, it can also be used to decompose the variation of different variables. And here in this slide, it shows the decomposition of wage growth and HSCP inflation into the main contributing factors and sources. So according to the model, as you can see, most of the variability of wage growth is explained by this catch-up effects to price shocks, where price shocks manifest themselves as shock to commodity prices or shortages in global value chains, but also food price shocks in the wake of the energy crisis. Okay, so it becomes clear that, besides performing a scenario analysis to strengthen the forecasting process, it's also important to consider the impact of monetary policy in this setting, as well as its calibration. Now, separately to that, in order to evaluate, to be able to say something about the effectiveness of past monetary policy, which will hopefully assist in calibrating future policy, we can also rely on counterfactual analysis. And here, we don't necessarily need to limit ourselves to a positive evaluation of policy, but we can also incorporate normative elements of such analysis. So a normative analysis of monetary policy is one where we can let interest rate in the model to be endogenously chosen by the central bank by minimizing a loss function, such as the one shown on the screen, which is designed to capture consumer welfare or policymaker preferences. So in the paper, which is cited at the bottom, we provide an illustrative example where we show how such potential normative analysis can be used to gauge the effects of past monetary policy based on one of the models we have at the division, the Euro-wide model, although it's important to stress that other models in the ECB perform the same type of exercises also for monetary policy preparation purposes. So in the last slide that I'll talk about, here we show the application of this optimal monetary policy analysis to the post-pandemic inflation surge. So the left-hand side illustrates the first period responses of the sequence of real-time optimal policy counterfactuals, as implied by the Euro-wide model, given by the yellow and orange diamonds, So different colored diamonds represent different calibrations of this loss function, which are conditional on the vintage of macro information consistent with that round. So in every point in time, there's a new information set that the policymaker observes, the model in our setting, and based on this new vintage of information, real-time information, it sets optimal policy. The idea is that the optimal policy prescription, so if you take the sequence of the diamonds, is relatively close to actual observed conduct by the central bank, by the ECB, which is in fact given by this solid blue line of the end of the December 2023 BMP. So before I conclude, finally, let me just so this kind of illustrates a bit the breadth of applications related to scenario analysis and the way that we can use these types of models to strengthen the forecasting process during periods of very high uncertainty. And in my final slide, let me just speak about how so the ECB, our division, the Forecasting and Policy Modeling division, but other divisions also involved in the forecast, are open in disseminating information about the projection process, but also about the forecasting performance and past forecast errors. And here we point to a list of references which speak in more detail about these topics. So from my side, I conclude here and I pass over to Matteo.
Just a final word then on two important aspects of this. One is modeling infrastructure. I mean, we work with the idea that models belong to the institutions, to the ECB, and they are part of the knowledge of the ECB. And therefore, this knowledge should be managed wisely, which means we want to leave as a legacy not just model in check, but also models that are part of an infrastructure that is supporting the model, the modelers and users experience. For instance, and that's what Matteo was showing, we'll show after, is a projection platform. That's a project that we've been working on in the last few years. That's the best example of what I was saying. So it's an end-to-end process, which is an infrastructure at the core of which the model are cast and which manages the data flow and all the reporting in the end. So this is a huge endeavor, which is part of a, say, transformational evolution of the ECB, also in many other areas. In the next slide, you have a summary of why this is important. Of course, it's important to keep version and control of the model, which preserve, as I said, institutional knowledge. It's easy for model developers, but this requires to abide to standards. So you don't just improvise the way you code or the software you use. Everything is more or less standardized. This gives also robustness because it's a sustainable kind of legacy for the institution. It's fully supported by our colleagues in the IT department, and it's of course a long-term solution that reduces risks and increases also the consensus, if you will. It leaves also more time for analysis, if you think about it, because there's a lot of time for a lot of automation that this process so that process can free time. And that's why it's also lean and efficient. So it's an efficient use of resources in that sense. So infrastructure is fundamental. It's an investment that we have been doing for many years now. And I will finish now with just a little advertisement of what is ongoing in terms of current modeling plans and the future agenda. There are two things that we stress in our paper in the conclusions. One is two ingredients that we call for soundness. One is humbleness. Model can fail, we know that, and they need to be constantly reviewed or complemented either by judgment or by other models. And this is the reason why we believe the suite of model approach will continue to be a very robust way of dealing with this, especially with uncertainty. And the other aspect is adaptability. So the inclusion of new economic theories and development, the thing that you want to keep abreast of the technological advances, not just for models, but also to keep this infrastructure. And the other essential ingredient is cooperation. Cooperation with the academia, cooperation with in the Eurosystem, cooperation also outside these usual borders, especially if you think about the so many data that are available nowadays, and the fact that everything should be, other partners actually are becoming part of this journey. So just to give a final slide on the future of modeling and what is currently available and what we are thinking to work on, and on which it would be great actually to hear also your view, is to consolidate first the current model capabilities, increasing the capabilities in terms of expectations, for instance, or in terms of including supply shocks or monitoring models, or including non-linearities and heterogeneity, acquiring new ideas. Here, heterogeneity has been mentioned already, structural changes, climate, digitization, and then finally, maybe try to think also a little bit beyond. We are also including AI and machine learning algorithms to handle new data or big data, and try to have interdisciplinary teams, as our climate change efforts recently show. The aim is, as I said before, cooperation even beyond the borders of the Eurosystem, and this is our the conclusion also of the OP on this final positive note. So thank you very much for this, and the floor to you, Juha.
Thanks a lot, Matthieu and Romanos, for this broad interview and some insights and also some specific examples. There are actually many good questions already in the chat. I don't know if you can also read them, Matthieu. If not, so let me try to summarize some of them. So there was one question relating to recent inflation search. So what were the findings of the ECB research on any changes in the expectation formation during the last inflation search? And to what extent has the inflation process changed due to this inflation increase? Also, depending on any changes in weights and price formation, has this affected the optimal monetary policy path? So that's one. Then there's an interesting question, a bit related. Well, let me just read it. Without an aspiration to build an all-encompassing model, is the ECB doomed to live in a partial world? Yeah, a bit philosophical question also. Then there's one question on concerning the slide, actual monetary policy conduct against real-time optimal policy benchmark. And the one asking the question refers that this is using the new area-wide model, but the earlier slide benchmarking our models against external models for standard monetary policy shock shows that the new area-wide model shows much greater sensitivity of the output gap and inflation to a monetary policy shock compared to the other models. So would the conclusions be significantly different in terms of using another model for the optimal short-term path? And asking if you had done such exercise already. So let me stop here. There were one question relating to expectation formation, one question relating to aspiration to build all-encompassing models, and one question relating to optimal path of monetary policy depending on which models you use. Back to you, authors.
I can start if you want, like few words. So when we answer now, we answer from the perspective, let's say, of the modeling group. Of course, if we speak for the ECB, you have a wealth of information you can find in either the economic bulletin, the working papers, occasional papers, or that documents a bit all the monitoring of inflation speeches also of our principles. That documents at length a bit all the challenges that were the assessment of the inflation process during the post-pandemic inflation surge, and whether how it cascades to actually forecasting or monetary policy preparation. So if I zoom back perhaps on this question about what we do with our modeling toolkits, so certainly in what perhaps Romano started to show, being right about the shocks was the first challenge. No? So we have been surprised by one-sided type of shock, or the energy shock was multidimensional with different propagation. So getting the shock right is a premise to even start to forecast right. The second was to always, I don't know if we call that humbleness, but that's the way we would use this word ourselves, put into question a bit the properties of the benchmark models. No? So one of the risk analysis example we gave before is really to challenge ourselves on the status of expectations, the price formation mechanism, and try to challenge incoming data against all these risks that could be looming. So I think that the radar screen of all these risks were very much there from the perspective of the model themselves. That would be one comment on that. On the one model versus, if we do one model, are we partial? I don't know. If we do more models that are not partial model, but general equilibrium models, you allow yourself to live in the complexity of model disagreement. But I think that's the cost we are willing to pay to perhaps err on the side of being robust. But this robustness, what does it mean? And that gives me to one comment on the example of monetary policy calibration. You saw that we disclosed even the economic bulletin a cross-model type of monetary policy evaluation that gives a range of, let's say a significant range of sensitivity about how much it could give. When we apply that to what you saw from the new AWM on monetary policy counterfactuals with the optimal policy exercise, let's not mix up what you would do when you evaluate monetary policy in isolation. What would an interest rate shock give in a given model versus what should happen to interest rates in a more realistic macro forecasting context. So a model could tend to agree much more on conditional forecasts of interest rates than on monetary policy evaluation. Okay, so a bit of a conceptual or technical discussion to have. So we have not written the exact same type of paper with Bayes, for example, but we could do that actually in the follow-up, but they may not disagree as much as you could suspect from an IRF perspective. And that's my 2 cents on the questions, but please, Matteo or Romanos.
The question, or
go ahead, Matteo, sorry.
Oh, no, the question by Ernest is a difficult one for me. So there are several parts in these questions. So there are other themes, as Matteo was suggesting, looking more carefully into inflation and also the underlying inflation and measures of trend inflation, for instance, which are not reflected in this presentation. To what extent the inflation source has changed inflation expectations formation? I'm not personally aware of things that have been done by us, but my colleagues may correct me. I'm not sure that we see this entrenchment into inflation, if this is what you mean. It's only like when you have a high inflation, perhaps also the persistence of inflation has increased, and then now the coming back is showing a higher persistence. And when you are in a higher persistence regime, we proved in some paper in the past also that the pass-through between wages and prices is higher. So there is some non-linearity and state contingency. This is something that we have shown in other papers, but whether this is business as usual or something different, I'm not sure that, of course, I mean, all the supply story is currently a big debate. And so to the extent to which this is generating structural issues, it's not yet clear, at least to me, but others may want to say something. And on whether any changes in wages and price formation has affected this optimal policy benchmark, I don't know if either Romanos or Matthieu have an answer to that based on the research that they've done.
So let me just thanks Matteo. Matteo, let me complement a bit the answers and try to provide some additional insights if possible. So I agree with what Matteo said indeed. So the propagation of an interest rate shock through the model might have a different prediction with respect to an optimal monetary policy response of that model, given, let's say, a loss function which is provided to the agents in the model. Interestingly, we have done. We haven't done an optimal policy, let's say, counterfactual, but we have looked at the rule-based counterfactual with other models that we have in the division, like the ECB MACE model, the semi-structural model, meaning that we provide, let's say, the full future set of information as an ex-post assessment of monetary policy through the lens of the ECB base model. And there, the predictions between the Euro-wide model and the ECB base, different classes of models, are relatively similar. With respect to expectations, so I wouldn't really have much to add here to what has already been said, but I think in one of the references that Matthieu mentioned, there is the sensitivity analysis, so changing somewhat expectation information in one of these models, and the result that emerges is that across classes of models, the results tend to become closer to each other following a monetary policy shock and the transmission of that shock to the economy, when expectations might be more similar across model varieties, meaning that the neuro-wide model has forward-looking expectations. The ECB-based structural class is backward-looking, but if you relax its assumptions to some extent, the predictions can come closer to each other. So I think I wouldn't dare to take over the philosophical questions, but I would stop here.
Thanks a lot. We are actually now just on time, well, almost on time. But there's really a great question there from Lucas Wilchelman about the user scenarios. He's primarily interested if the use of scenarios or building the scenarios are casual procedure in the daily work of the forecasters. Are they really only an option for the special cases? I thought that you may want to give a short, maybe a written answer in the chat for that, because I think it's important to bring this forward for other participants. But to make sure that we have sufficient amount of time for the next session, I think we are ready to move there, and I would hand in to Alessandro Notarpietro from Banca d'Italia, who will moderate the next session. So thanks a lot for everybody. Thanks for good questions and also the answers and the presentations. Thank you. Alessandro, for you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. So this is the beginning of session 2. We're going to have, after this interesting presentation about the ECB toolkit, we're going to have 2 presentations by distinguished scholars in the field. So we're going to have Professor Martin Weale from King's College London, who is a well-known professor, well-known in the academia, but he's also had a lot of experience in policy. He was head of the National Institute for Economic and Social Research, and he's also been a member of the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee. So he will provide us a view from both the academic perspective, but also from the policy work. And then we'll have Jesper Linde from the International Monetary Fund. Jesper is also a well-known scholar, especially among modelers, I would say, in the modeling community. Jesper was at the Federal Reserve Board before, and he's also been at the Riksbank. And he was one of the pioneers in the use of DSG models back in the Riksbank days for policy modeling and forecasting. So without further ado, I will give the floor to the first speaker, who is Professor Weale. We will have about 15 minutes for each speaker, and then 10 to 15 minutes in the end for questions and answers. So please, Professor Weale, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and Ernest, thank you for sharing the slides. I should certainly say that the next slide, please. I should certainly say that the ECB has presented an impressive piece of work. But the modelling need, I think, is to forecast economic outturns, provide tools for showing the effects of policy changes, and I found myself wondering how far the forecasts you produce actually influence or interact with the decisions that the ECB Council makes. That's an obvious question. That said, you have an impressive range of models, DSGE models, FARS, semi-structural models, and models that reflect the needs of policy makers. I found myself wondering whether perhaps there were so many models, how did they fit together? But the presentation that we've just had gave a good account of that. I suppose I nevertheless worry that with a range of different models, at least I'm thinking of the context of policy making at the Bank of England, different people would seize onto different models to reflect their prejudices, and there would be a risk that that different simulations and so on would serve to create as much noise as light. Certainly, what you do is very different to the situation in the UK. The models are maintained on a regular basis. You talked about the importance of investment in them, and I think that puts you in quite a different position from at least my experience of policy making at the Bank of England, where the question was always, what's changed since our last forecast? And if you weren't sure whether you believed the last forecast or not, producing a forecast based purely on what had changed since the last forecast, though, didn't always seem terribly helpful. But that was certainly the position that we were in for much of the time I was on the Monetary Policy Committee. And from reading the Banca report, it seems to me that it has probably still been the stock in trade of Bank of England forecasting. Anyway, as I say, it would be nice to know how far the Council relies on models. You talked about putting judgment in. I wondered whether or how far that was systematic modelling of residuals, or whether you were relying on policymakers' judgments. But anyway, for all this, I found myself wondering, how far has it actually helped? Next slide, please. So what I thought I'd do, and I apologise that these forecasts are for the UK, the first component you can't produce for the euro area because the euro area didn't exist 50 years ago. But the question I asked was, how has the ability of forecasts to manage a major supply shock changed? The first couple of bars on the chart shows the forecast produced in April 1973 for the fourth quarter of 1974. So that's before the oil crisis became apparent. And you can see that 6% inflation was forecast. The realisation was something over 16%. That's worse than we had this time round, but not actually a lot worse. At much the same time, in August 2021, inflation of about 2.5% was forecast for the fourth quarter of 2022, and we actually got about 11%, nearly 11% inflation. So it was about a 9 percentage point error compared with a 10 percentage point error. What I think it would be difficult to say that that was much of an improvement. And sorry, someone keeps phoning me. It would be difficult to say that that was much of an improvement. And perhaps the moral that comes out of this is that supply side problems supply side shocks always arise. The nature of shocks is that you can't forecast them. So perhaps these are the big outlying events that you referred to. But if we assessed the performance of forecasts by their connection with without terms, as I say, it doesn't look like much of an improvement. Where I think we have had a more substantial improvement is in the next slide, please. Where we have had a more substantial improvement is in the follow-on. So here, what I've got in the first part of the chart are the inflation forecasts produced in August 74 for the fourth quarter of 1975, and you can see in the UK there was about an 8-point error, whereas in the recent episode the forecast was really quite precise by that stage. And is the explanation of this that we have better modelling? I suppose I think rather more it's because the policy framework has changed. With the anchor of an inflation target, it becomes much easier to produce accurate forecasts of inflation some time ahead. In the 1970s, next slide please, in the 1970s UK inflation was thought to be a random walk, whereas now it's largely target reverting. The question of how far the credibility of the target can be sustained isn't a question that can be answered, I think, by the varied approaches to economic modelling set out in the paper. What I do think, however, is that they will indicate what happens if the credibility of the target isn't sustained. And that really brings me to the question that Mervyn King asked a couple of years ago, that the point he made was, why in the models he was shown at the Bank of England did inflation always revert to target? And the answer was that the target was an attractor. Mervyn King famously said that this was like the economics of King Canute. The inflationary tide would turn round because the Bank of England wanted it to, and that may or may not actually be the case, but he was suggesting at the time that there was an element of wishful thinking, and perhaps one needed to pay more attention to other variables, to movements in nominal variables. So there are issues about what provides the anchor in your framework. Is it expectations and the policy framework, or is it movements in nominal variables? Where does the inflation anchor come from? And I'd be interested to hear whether you have any thoughts on that. Next slide, please. Then an issue that you didn't mention, but was certainly very much in my mind at the Bank of England. When we had forward-looking rational expectations models, we would ask, or at least, well, I wasn't the only person who asked, what would happen if the interest rate were just unilaterally reduced? And the answer, of course, in those models was that the rate of inflation would fall in line with the interest rate. In other words, the Fisher equation would rule the roost. Now, President Erdogan believed that for a long time, but I think most policymakers, certainly the people I worked with, didn't believe that that would be the case. So there's a question, how far should we trust models which have that as a property? Is it a feature of your models or not? But it seems to me to point to a reliance for forecasting and many policy purposes to models such as the Federal Reserve Board's US model, or what I understand to be a relative of your model, the ECB multi-country model. Bernanke suggested that the Bank of England Beckham had a quarterly model of this type. Certainly that model wasn't found to be terribly satisfactory. The way the short run and the long run anchored seemed to me really rather uncomfortable. People were supposed to be modeling, behaving optimally in the long term, but not in the short term. And that just raised a question, what were they doing in the short term if they weren't behaving optimally? So, how far something like the ECB multi-country model would resemble that, how far it would be something different, I'm not sure. But the sense I have of the Federal Reserve Board model is that it is a flexible tool that makes it possible, for example, to review the impacts of different approaches to inflation expectations. And it seems to me that that's the model one should want to be relying on for forecasting purposes. So next and final slide, please. I think, sorry, it's not the final slide. There is a question, is all the information in prices or do quantities matter when we think about the effects of monetary policy on inflation? The ECB used to go big on the twin pillars, but I think it's actually quite a while since I've heard those mentioned, but perhaps quantities do matter. Certainly Charles Goodhart and Mervyn King have both argued that. Now, Hank models do show quantity effects because some people are rationed. Some people can't optimize. The shadow prices they face aren't the same as the prices that are observed in the markets. So people need to borrow, or they need governments to do the borrowing for them. There was a sort of plaintive comment that the Hank world wasn't a Ricardian world. Well, I suppose I don't think I've met many policymakers who have thought that the Ricardian world was a good approximation to reality. So perhaps quantities do matter, and that will limit, at least may limit, the role of simple forms of dynamic stochastic rational expectations models. So, final slide, please. What I would say, there was a question, why not have it all in one model? I certainly wouldn't try and put everything all in one model. I mean, further than that, I'd never think, I'd advise modelers never to think that the ideal model is just round the corner. Models are meant to be simplifications, and simplifications are useful except when the things that matter have been left out in the simplifications. And perhaps thinking of circumstances of supply side shocks is one aspect of that, but deciding what to put in, what to leave out, always an art, not a science, and it's always eventually wrong-footed by events. All I can say is that only young people would ever claim to be good at forecasting. I think by the time you've been in it for a while, you know that you can have runs of good luck and you can have runs of bad luck, and that's just what happens. The big problems, I think it's fair to say, haven't all been solved yet, and actually we may not know what they are. But anyway, let me thank you for a very interesting presentation, which raised a lot of points and certainly made me think quite a lot about what a modelling framework should look like.
Thanks a lot, Professor Weale, for this very interesting discussion and presentation. So I'll give the floor to Jesper Linde for another presentation and follow-up, and then we'll devote a final 10 to 15 minutes for replies by ECB colleagues and Q&A, especially from the chat. I see there's a few questions already. Please, Jesper.
Thank you very much for inviting me to discuss this very interesting paper. I really enjoyed reading this paper, and I wish I had more time to think about it and comment upon it. So I will really only talk about two issues. I think there are many things in this paper that I sort of agree upon, and I think impressively shows how ECB staff has developed like a mix of tools to think about pressing policy issues. I must say, I'm not going to talk about expectations or rational expectations here, but the comment from Martin, just prompted me to say one thing in that regard, namely that, of course, what the rational expectation models imply is that a credible commitment to raising inflation. For doing that, if you want to raise the inflation target, you will see higher nominal rates. But of course, if you lower a policy rate and you think that that's directly going to lead to lower inflation, then you are not at least using standard New Keynesian central bank models, because lowering the interest rate in a standard New Keynesian model, you lower the real rate and you get high inflation as a result of that. So I just want to comment that is the fact that you get on autopilot, just lower the rate, you get lower inflation, is not an implication of the Fisher equation and the rational expectations model. Okay, but set that aside. So what I was thinking I'll talk about is nonlinearities in Phillips curves, and I think that can be important for policy and scenario analysis. Is sort of things that I think, these are sort of things that I think could be, sort of be discussed in more depth in the report. But I think, Matteo touched upon this and he sort of said where things are going forward. I think you're thinking about these things. I think another missing thing that I think deserves more thinking among us economists is monetary and fiscal interactions. I also think that cross-country linkages are very important, spillovers and between countries, where I think is interesting. And then I wanted to ask, it's maybe it's in there and you have it already, but it's a little bit in there, I think, but not as much as I would like it. I think and I think Martin touched upon this, the merit of disaggregation, sort of making the models finer. I would want to know more about, what is the merit of a bottom-up versus top-down approaches for your area. Then I put in two things, but I actually didn't have time to prepare those for slides. So I was going to talk on parts A to D and then wrap up with some final thoughts. So I wrote an article in Oxford Review of Economic Papers that I think DSG models remain a key policy tool for central banks for a foreseeable future. And I think the report basically agrees to this. You want to have like a suite of models, which seems sensible in many ways. DSGs are one part of that arsenal. And in that Oxford paper, I also argued that large institutions, say like the ECB and Fed, can most likely have sufficient staff to retain several type of models and meaningfully apply them in policy analysis. Still, I think that the table 1 in the paper suggests that important staffing challenges may lie ahead, because if we look at academic research, it's simple and stylized, as the paper notes. It's deep theoretical foundations and mostly mainstream and frontier, whereas policy modeling, as I think you correctly note, is sort of realistic and try to be more realistic and granular. You have a very sort of people who think very carefully about the transmission of policy and how big, what do we get for the 100 basis points interest rate hike on inflation and output? Those are sort of key things that economists at central banks are thinking about, sort of the propagation of rule of thumb shocks and how they sensibly propagate. And that, to think about that and what you need to tweak models to get that and whether the data likes that or not, is sort of really important for modelers at central banks, but not necessarily what sort of, is done in academia, what new students coming out is sort of trained to think about. So I think that is, when sort of models used by central bank is no longer sort of mainstream academic frontier material, it could be, challenging to staff modeling units at central bank with staffers that are specialists in this. Okay, I think that one thing that I was missing was sort of talking about nonlinearities. There were Romanos, you mentioned a scenario that you've done, the September 21, it's chart 12 in the report on page 45, where you showed like an upside risk in the main projection, then an upside and downside. And there were some differences, sort of, there was smaller upside risk but a bigger downside risk. And I wonder if that reflected nonlinearities, was just how you faced in shocks, basically. So it wasn't really a property of the model you're using, more like how you size the various scenarios. Anyway, I think that Phillips curve may be considerably more nonlinear than previously thought, is work that I've done recently with Martin Harding at the Banca of Canada and Matthias Trabant. And there's also, of course, nice new work by Benigno and Egerson on this. And this doesn't normally matter when the economy is hit with small shocks, nonlinearities, and inflation is close to target. But when inflation starts to drift away from the central bank's target, and so the economy hit by big shocks, we have that. We have a model where you get an endogenously low slope of the Phillips curve when inflation is low, below target, but a higher slope when inflation rises above the central bank targets. And that has important implications for policy. It means much larger transmission of fiscal and monetary policy stimulus, for instance, when inflation is elevated by a mix of adverse supply and strong private demand. And we argue, in work I'm currently doing with Chris Ursig and Matthias Trabant, that these nonlinearities may be important for policy design. And I think this points to one possible limitation with linearized models that I think we need to think about moving forward. And I want to point out that the nonlinearities that we have, you mentioned this work by Bernanke and Blanchard, their model is very interesting, that they basically argue that the standard linearized model can sort of reasonably well fit the inflation boom, the surge in inflation. But we want to point out that our model with our nonlinear formulation of the Phillips curve actually fit both the missing deflation puzzle, i.e. that inflation fell very little after the GFC, versus, that inflation can also, the same model can also explain why inflation rose so much in the post-COVID period. And that's sort of like a constant parameter. So I wanted to ask you whether that Bernanke, I haven't read and done work with that model, but it would be very interesting if you could tell me a little bit what if that model actually, how it does during the GFC. So for instance, this is US data. You run a standard Smets and Wouters, you get a period of significant deflation. So what you need in the Smets and Wouters is this positive cost push shock to prevent inflation from falling more. And here, you know, whereas in nonlinear formulation, you're basically in the center tendency of inflation during the period. So you do not rely to the same extent on this positive cost push shock. And we also argue that the same model has a non-linear, so basically the Phillips curve, instead of being the blue line linear here, you get this banana curve. So cost push shocks can propagate much more when inflation is elevated above the central bank's target. And also, in fact, also cost push shocks can propagate more too when inflation is high. So there's much more inflation risk basically in a high inflation, high and rising inflation environment. So it would be nice to, I think these are point to some interest different. I think actually if you just estimate standard Phillips curve relationship, you know, it supports this idea that there is something time varying with the sensitivity of inflation to variations in marginal costs and output gap. Okay, let me just touch on another challenge, I think, which I think is worthy to think about more, is fiscal monetary policy interactions. And of course, the EMU is based on active monetary by ECB coupled with passive fiscal policies in every currency union nation, and that determines the price level in each member nation. Now, that view is sort of, you take a standard two-country New Keynesian model that you have, and I think you have a new area-wide model. If you refine it a little bit, this is what you will get. You get a unique equilibrium as it's in Leaper. If central bank is active, ECB is active, and the other countries are passive. Now, that same model, if one of the member countries in that currency union does not pursue passive fiscal policy, you have indeterminacy in such a framework, which I think is not sort of like a nice property of a model. So it would be, I think that, you know, modeling of government debt is very simplistic in standard models. And I think it would be, given that debt is rising, has risen a lot over time, and there may be more pressures on fiscal policy down the road, it seems like this is an area of further thinking on down the road, how that should be properly integrated in our models and implications for monetary policy. I think there is interesting work along this dimension by Leaper, Nora Trum, and Chris Matthews. Francesco Bianchi has done interesting work with Faccini and Melosi, and also Frank Smets and Ralph Wouters is doing some interesting work in this area, which I find really interesting, important. I have a couple of slides here on sort of data to argue that. It's not that I want to say that, you know, you have fiscal theory at the price level. I'm actually not, I think what I've seen so far, not really a believer of the pure theory of the fiscal FTPL, but I do think that like Leaper and I mean sort of like Frank Smets and Ralph Wouters, they're trying that maybe some part of this debt maybe try to, you know, maybe have to be, could pose inflation risks, and or not in the way, say, the pure standard FTPL theory posits. I think if you look at Greece, for instance, Ireland, they're more Keynesian stories than I think than FTPL. And, you know, given that you see from this government debt dynamics and inflation for several Euro countries, it's not evident at all here that post-COVID inflation surge was driven by FTPL. But I still think that this is still maybe relevant moving forward. We should think about these issues. Okay, let's just say a few words on, I think you have this, you know, in neuro-wide model, it's a model, I think it's well known that it normally has small international spillovers, like our model that we worked in at the Riksbank. That's often a feature with structural macro models. And here I think the semi-structural gives you a lot of mileage, the possibility to sort of wire in more realistic spillovers among euro area countries. So I can appreciate that that is an argument for the semi-structural approach and maybe very fruitful for you here. So that's, I think, clearly one argument in favor of that. Still, you know, I wanted to know the merits of sort of like it would be nice to drill deeper, I think, the merits of a top-down versus bottom-up. And Martin talked about this, you know, in the spirit of keeping models simple, what is really the benefit with, say, ECB MC model relative to the new area-wide model if you just want to think about the euro area aggregates? I can see that there are arguments for more disaggregated, sort of the multi-country that you want to have that, for instance, if you think about financial fragilities. But in standard monetary policy rounds where you do not have, you know, you do not have to consider these financial fragilities, it would be nice to know a bit more about the merits of a top-down versus bottom-up approach. You have this work on section 3.2. You look at the forecasting performance, some exercises between NAVN and New Area-Wide Model 2 and MC, but there are different horizons, so they're not quite comparable, and we do not see sort of how the forecast looked like really, which I think is, it's not the RMSEs that matters per se, it's more like the interest rate, how the shape of the projections that I think is more interesting to me. So it would be interesting to know a little bit more. What do you get from this multi-country setup, really? Okay, let me just say a final thought before I conclude. And I think the ECB staff has really developed an impressive and important arsenal of tools to provide policy advice. You know, I think I've tried to talk about some areas where further work may be valuable. And I think that many of these areas I pointed to, and that's my final picture, I think is actually best addressed, at least in the first pass, with structural models. I think there is going to be a key role for structural macro models in the foreseeable future. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jesper, for this very interesting discussion. So I will give the floor to ECB presenters for replies to these two discussions, and then let's target 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll devote a few minutes in the end for questions from the chat. So please, Matteo and colleagues, just jump in.
Yeah, perhaps I can start this time, and the others may complement. So thanks a lot to both of you, because these are extremely important and very reasonable comments. How far does the Council rely on models? This is a great question. I would say they certainly care about the goodness of our model toolkit. And this is proven by the fact that there's been a lot of even the internal debate, and I don't know how much of this has actually been outside the internal circle on you know how we could improve models when our forecast is not certainly one of the best one. Let me just remind two things here. First, forecast errors are not errors of the models only. So the forecast as it is done is a combination, as you also rightly suggest, of models and judgment. And the judgment here is purely staff judgment, is not really policy maker judgment. The other thing I want to remind is related to this. The staff, it's a staff projection at the ECB, so the ownership is on the staff. And therefore, if there is an interaction in between with the policy making, it's taken, of course, on board. Now, the final result that goes to the policymaker is for their final judgment. We don't know, say, their utility function, in a sense. We give them a distribution, and this distribution is used you know, as another kind of information from them. So forecast errors, actually, I mean, I can put a slide on if you allow me. Let me see if I can share, just to give you a sense, because I think this is a fundamental, it's a fundamental question. Can you see my slides? So, Martin, so these are the forecast mistakes that we have done with HICP recently. Okay, so our history goes to 99, as you rightly point out. So we don't have but the comparison is already very telling, right? So there is a big forecast error here, both for headline HICP and for HICP excluding energy. What we try to do with the models, and again, and so for instance, this is the forecasting vintage by vintage of our HICP inflation and HICP inflation excluding energy. You see the big mistakes that we are doing here until up to a point in which actually the mistakes are vanishing. So in the period where you also signal between end of 22, 23, the mistakes becomes much smaller. Now, of course, we have our models are helpful to give an explanation of what these mistakes are. Most of it is impact of energy in this. This is a 1 quarter ahead in HICP inflation forecast errors, for instance. But we can go also farther and we say how much of this energy is actually due to assumptions. And this is what is explained here. Blue is assumptions, yellow is remaining. So there is something else which has not been explained. And this is something absolutely important we actually take into account. So there is a lot of internal debate about it. And this is a recent presentation that we made recently. Now, the importance of the model is also actually take these forecast errors and give an interpretation either through the lens of structural or semi-structural models, just to see whether there are factors that are pointing in other directions. So we do have an extensive analysis about this. In terms of credibility of target, I mean, I leave this to also my colleagues. I'm not sure that they necessarily depends on models. As I said, models are part of a big machinery, and the fact that the model is wrong by definition, as you say, can be changed. I'm not sure this should affect the credibility of an institution. On the rational expectation model, I share what Jesper said before. That's on one side. Regarding very briefly on what Jesper said, non-linearities, absolutely, this is fundamental. But I have a philosophical point here. When you have a model in which you model non-linearity in a very general form, you don't even know what this non-linearity may be generated from. And it can be one of the factors we are trying actually to rationalize, giving a name in our models. And that's why you find some sort of comparison between them. So I understand that this is an important issue which we should go deeper. Whether the Bernanke-Blanchard has been applied to the great financial crisis, I'm not actually sure, but this is a great point. This should be, the model should be tested against that as well. For monetary policy and fiscal interaction, I suggest you look at the occasional paper 337 of the ECB, in which all of what you say is basically accounted for, including the academic papers that you mentioned. There is an extensive use of our models and literature to give a sense of what this means for monetary policy conduction, both when they were sort of going in the same direction, fiscal and monetary policy, and when they actually pointed to different ones. So I think you can find an extensive part. On the spillovers, and I finish here, but I let also Matthieu here because I know he has a much better answer I have on this part, the merit of top-down versus bottom-up. So from a purely econometric point of view, I personally prefer always the heterogeneity and the bottom-up, say, the aggregation after the estimation. Because if you have heterogeneity, econometrically, by aggregating the data before, you get biased results. But I think there is an institutional constraint, as Matteo was telling at the beginning of the presentation, which is we are, by institution, we have to talk about countries. And therefore, that's why we develop a multi-country model and linked among them to make sure that we also address the spillover part. But on this, I leave there because I think my colleagues may complement better. So thank you very much. I think that's been a fantastic discussion.
Yeah, my 2 cents on the, thanks so much for these two very thought-provoking discussion. And I think that's the beauty of having to hold the bar of a modeling function in policy institution. You need to be open to type of discussion like Professor Weale or like Jesper did. And you see, they don't say the same thing at all. So we need to embrace these two aspects. So I'm not sure I will be able to dwell on many components of that. Just one word, indeed, the bottom-up, top-down. So whoever understands how the ECB works and how the Eurosystem actually prepares monetary policy decisions would understand that there is a huge amount of cross-country assessment. let alone you cannot preach one day you want the fiscal monetary interaction in the euro area and then say we should keep euro-wide model. So there's a big institutional context of it, but for many of the assessment, we need a level of granularity, and I think the institutional scars from perhaps the previous decades tells us that it's good to have on the shelf also a lot of analytical apparatus that could nest a lot of cross-country heterogeneity within the euro area. And at the end, the euro system works as the euro system. Each national central banks have their own perspective on this. That's one small point. On the rest, I think I could subscribe to a lot of things said, a lot of precision of what we are doing to Professor Weale. I think we could exchange directly because the time is a bit short. But certainly we have some of your concern at heart. No? One thing is to be able to clog on the academia. Don't misinterpret us. It's not because we say that the stable portfolio may be a bit more gradualist, that we don't scan and level up to whatever is the frontier. So I think I'm very pleased to have a team of amazingly qualified experts and academics that makes it possible for us. But changing the core models, changing the institutional discussion about the core models is something we are very cautious about. And of course, we keep on our own toolbox the ability to be able to confront the like a big picture topic, like are you comfortable with the interest rate channel or the Fisher effect at the core of some of your models against other? So that's why we have a bit model don't agree on that. And the base would have very different type of consumption function that we could have in the new AWM if you want. But there's more. But thanks so much for your slides. I think we would ponder on them for sure. Thanks a lot.
If I just have to say something, I would just add that in the division we also like or try to do some research. So our colleagues, we have different tastes and different specializations. So this usually makes it into some kind of satellite model, the questions we're after. And the hope is eventually that these satellite models can be used or to inform a bit the channels in the core models. This is a bit the approach that the division is after. So we try to account for some at least of the topics that Jesper, you talked about in the beginning. Thanks a lot for the comments by both of you. They were indeed very useful.
Thanks, Romanos, Matthieu, and Matteo for the follow-up. I think we have time for maybe one or two questions from the chat. I see there's a reply, but Jesper, you can actually have a look at it about nonlinearities in the Phillips curve and the sources of nonlinearities. One question that was raised by Ernest, I think at the end of the first session, but I'm not sure we covered it, is about the existence of a trade-off in a way, if I understand it correctly, between a central bank's transparency on the tools that are used for capital and policymaking, and so the need to be accountable and transparent in the decision-making process, but on the other hand, the desire to sort of keep an edge over markets, or even the desirability of a diversity of views among policymakers and various market participants. So avoiding groupthink, enhance robustness, and so on. So I think this is an open question to the speakers. So please.
I can start. I think it's so it's a great point, and this OP is an attempt to actually to be as transparent as we can on some of the models part. Now, of course, I see the trade-off, no, because there can be a conflict between some communication kind of line of the institution and and then the possibility of actually even deploying not just a model or the description of the model, but if I understand you correctly, even the codes to do some simulation with the model. This may generate some question by saying, okay, I'm not getting the same that you guys are getting on the official publication. So that's why, in this way, I read your question. And having you been in an institution like in the Euro system, you know that this is managing this trade-off is of course not easy, but from a modeling point of view, from a technical perspective, I think it's still possible, because as I said before, and if you are clear on the communication, if you are very clear on what you are doing, what you are publishing, and what is the use for it, and how it is used inside as a part of a bigger information set for the policymaker, I think people could understand and we can solve partly this trade-off. I'm not sure you would solve it fully, otherwise you would have seen many more publications along the way. So it's really something to think about, because this, as you say, stimulates a lot the debate, and it's transparency. I mean, but personally, very much in favor of being even much more transparent, but of course with careful. We have a blog now also in which we show, we go a little bit, with ECB as a blog, a little bit farther than the usual publication like bulletin and so on. So there is a tendency to actually expose a little bit more, but the trade-off remains.
Okay, I don't know if anyone else wants to add on this. Otherwise, we can move to maybe a final question from the chat that is related to how is it possible. The question is from Paul Fisher. How is it possible to distinguish between a forecast mistake and a policy mistake? That may be related to the 2021 inflation episode. Was it a forecast mistake? Was it a policy mistake? And there's a related question, I think, by Christian Conrad, who refers to what is the forecast horizon that policy should focus on. In 2022, policy shifted towards a data-driven as opposed to forecast-driven approach. Will there be a shift back to a forecast-driven approach? And again, what is the horizon policy should focus on? So please.
Can I have some thoughts on that? So again, to explain the trade-off, you have the right disclaimers on all the talk we had on the occasional paper. When we talk to you today, we talk to you more as experts from the ECB on our own purpose, but with the model currently in use, with some typology of the exercise done that are disclosed. From this perspective, I can answer. So some of the models can be used in principle to assess our forecast errors could be driven by various elements of nature, could be shocks, things that you could not foresee, could be changing behaviors, or could be misrepresented behaviors. And in the category misrepresented behaviors, policy conduct, if wrongly approximated by the model, could be part of it, or if policy changed. So in principle, model can can address some of these aspects of what is driven by policy or the formulation of policy. How it's done and how operated is a full other realm, and many ways can be deployed. I think that's on one aspect. On the forecast and the data dependence, okay, let's not mix up. You can be very much data dependent and fully oriented towards the forecast. The forecast has plenty of elements into it, and certainly data. So I think it's not, I will not spell, I guess you may have another type of trade-off in mind, but for the assessment and preparation of policy, being data-driven or forecast-driven for our practitioner elements is a bit of the same object. So you're really into new information and what they would tell you about the policy relevant horizon. And as far as the ECB or Eurosystem forecast is concerned, so the horizon of our forecast is a fixed horizon. Doesn't mean it's a policy relevant horizon. I don't know if anyone wants to add or.
Thanks, Matthieu. I think we are almost done, and I will give the floor to Ernest for final remarks. And thanks all, and I will thank all participants to session 1 and 2.
Alessandro, may I just say one thing?
Absolutely, yes. Yes,
okay,
please.
but I was thinking, I fully agree with Matteo. So my intuition was a granular should always work better than a sort of top-down. That was my thing. But then I must say, I'm not going to say who, but I've talked to people who have sort of, a number of senior Fed staff has started Amazon, as you may know. And one of those persons, he actually told me that the reason was that they figured out that a top-down, like a macro approach, helps Amazon to forecast, consumption demand better than a bottom-up. You would think that a bottom-up, Amazon, they have like tons of information they can sort of assess. But he argued that it was actually the opposite. So that's what they're doing there. They're helping them with forecasting demand using macro models.
We don't have tons of countries within the euro area, so I don't know.
No, fair enough. Fair enough. I just think it made the analogy.
Okay, so this concludes today's SUERF ECB Bank of Finland, Banca d'Italia workshop. on ECB macroeconomic models for forecasting and policy analysis, state of play, appraisal, way forward. A big thanks to Matthieu and Romanos from the ECB for sharing your knowledge, for opening a glimpse into your toolbox, to Martin and to Jesper for your excellent and thoughtful discussions, and to you, Juha and Alessandro, for the smooth moderation, and finally to all of you for your interest and for your participation in this workshop. Bye-bye and take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.